Hello, my name is Tito Justin. I am a student at School of International Training Graduate Institute, and I am doing my Master's in Sustainable Development. Welcome to this case study. This is a case study on human flourishing, one of the topics in sustainable development. And in this case study, I am looking at the structural adjustment policies, and my argument is based in South Sudan. So I actually developed this case study from a quote during a lecture by Professor Allen that says structural adjustment policies are a practice adopted mostly by international superpower countries in which what they do in developing countries like South Sudan is to serve themselves, placing debtor countries in constant, recurring, and inescapable disadvantage. Again, in the same lectures, she quoted Marcelo Almeida in 2007, where Marcelo, in her research, found that changes in fiscal policy based on IMF conditionality threaten social safety nets, including health care, as well as availability of sanitation, electricity, and food price controls. So here my argument is going to be based not only on IMF. I will be including other bodies, specifically the humanitarian aid agencies, donor countries, who at the same time are also giving money to IMF, resulting to these structural adjustment policies that is not favoring developing countries like South Sudan. Now here we go. So when you look at South Sudan as a new country, so South Sudan is actually a rich country and it has a lot of resources. And I looked at the economy of South Sudan, typical for a newly established developing country, sustained by abundant natural resources. We have abundant oil reserves and other natural resources in its territories. So in this case study, we will also look at these types of natural resources. I'll give a brief introduction to these types of natural resources. And the case study also examines how the current South Sudan economy is structured to benefit foreign countries. This is what I have realized. Due to political instability, they are taking the political instability as an advantage, and then weak economic and development policies currently existing in the country. So now when you look at the country itself, it is dependent on loans, specifically from IMF, donor countries, which is much being inflicted into foreign policies, and other aid agencies donations that is currently in the country. So despite all these economic viability, the natural resources, so we mostly develop on loans and donations from other countries. And this presentation has significance when considering the appropriate monetary and fiscal development and economic policy for South Sudan, as well as focus on foreign aid. Yes, you might not know where South Sudan is located, and up to now, even our colleagues in the region, in the East African region, still misplace us and they call us Sudanese. So we seceded from Sudan in 2011. Now we are called South Sudanese. This is an independent and sovereign country. So South Sudan is located in East Africa, a region which also includes 6 other countries. We have Kenya, we have Tanzania, we have Uganda, we have Burundi, Ethiopia, and recently the Democratic Republic of Congo is negotiating to join the region. So South Sudan is one of Africa's richest countries, but its economic level is relatively low than other countries in the same region, simply because of continued war or conflict and political instability, which is currently in the country. So most of the people in South Sudan also live without direct access to the income from the oil, and then 82% of the population reside in rural areas, and at least 49.4% exist below the poverty line. So I am giving you a brief historical background, just very brief, highlighting years, the most important years of event. I'm not giving it all, but just like highlighting mostly the most important parts that resulted to the creation of this new country called South Sudan. So in 1956, Sudan gains its independence after an agreement between the United Kingdom and Egypt. This is Sudan. And then in 2005, North and then South Sudan Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The CPA ends a very long war, more than 21 years of war, that was signed in Kenya. And then in 2011, South Sudan gains its independence after a referendum in January. Now again in the same time, 2013, this country backslided to war and the situation remains fragile up to date. So we have 10 main states. We have the Western Baragazal state, Northern Baragazal. We have Warab, Unity, Lakes, Jongole, Upper Nile, Western, Eastern, and Central Equatoria regions that comprises of this great country, South Sudan. In other words, this newly country, South Sudan. Now we have contested some of the contested areas like the Abbey. I just don't want to talk more about them, but still go with these 10 states, which is already being recognized as the regions in the state. So that's briefly about the background and the map. If you can look at the map, this is the map of South Sudan. Yes, I said it before. I said we are rich in natural resources and then a lot of minerals in this country. It is really, really extremely very rich. We have the petroleum. Before gaining independence from Sudan, South Sudan produces approximately 85% of Sudanese oil, and most of this oil by then Sudan is located in South Sudan. So we now own all this part of the oil. Now agriculture land, we have one of the major resources of South Sudan is agriculture land. The country is really very rich and most of the parts of the country is really very rich, and this up now is not being discovered. We have the marble. There are several marbles deposited in the Capoeira region, that is the Eastern Equatoria, and we also have aluminium deposits with at least 3 of the areas containing the mineral in the value above 4.5%. And we also have iron ore. The mineral remains largely unexploited due to the ongoing civil war and lack of proper infrastructure to really go and mine these to contribute to the economy of the country. And again, gold is one of the resources. We have gold in Eastern Equatoria, Central Equatoria, and also Western Equatoria. So gold mining is now the main source of income for the people living in the eastern part of South Sudan, and then especially in Greater Capoeira, Eastern Equatoria, and also a minimal rural mining in Central and Western Equatoria state. So when you look at the map, we have there oil, a lot of oil that area, and this side in Capoeira we have gold. There is also gold here and gold here, and the other resources that are in this country. So for now, the economy of the country is solely dependent on the oil sector, the only hope. The oil sector is the crucial industry in South Sudan, but mostly benefited by foreign influence, taking the advantage of the conflict to inflict by the policies that benefits them, e.g. the IMF and mostly the donor countries. And from an output of only 2,000 barrels per day in 1993, for now, South Sudan, the production has reached 490,000 barrels per day by 2009. And then I think up to now, we have over hundreds of thousands of barrels being produced per day. And its citizens are still not benefiting from these resources. So we are currently, the country is really in a bad shape of infrastructure. There are bad roads. There is no good road. The states are really not connected. The only main road, high road, connects Uganda from the border, Uganda, Nimule to Juba. and they're only in Juba. I think let me say 0.5% of Juba is only being tarmacked, so the area completely is not being tarmacked, and there is an issue of infrastructure. So the dominant player of this South Sudan oil production sector is actually China. And then if you look at India gets a small part of it. And when you look at this country, all these countries are member countries of the IMF. So they are currently the one dealing with the oil in South Sudan. And at the same time, this money they get, they bring it back to South Sudan as loans. So since the CPA in 2005, the government of South Sudan has been creating its national budget based on revenue, resources from oil, and personal income tax, customs, and so on. And then humanitarian aid also remains the only hope to provide basic needs and social services to the people in South Sudan, weakening the economic further. So despite all these natural resources that we have in the country, still aid agencies and loans are the hopes of even the government and the general population. So before we proceed, I just wanted to highlight something on the non-oil industry, which also has been neglected. I mentioned a lot of them, like agriculture. So the second largest industry of South Sudan, as I said before, is agriculture. This country holds one of the richest agricultural areas in Africa in the White Nile Valley. Very fertile soils and abundant waters are all available. So we are not making use of the Nile. Even water in Juba, where the Nile passes, is very difficult. Although the Nile has an issues, but South Sudan is not deeply involved in that issues. Even we are not making use of that. And South Sudan also have 10 to 20 million head of cattle, according to the 2008 Sudan Housing and Population Census, and then no one is investing in these sectors because investment in the country is foreign and dictated to interests only. So access to local markets and trade is very limited, and this results in very limited income levels for rural farmers, and the other sectors in South Sudan are still not significant to contribute to the revenue of the country. Yeah, we talked a lot on the resources and the economy of South Sudan, and with all these resources we have in the country, although we still have conflict in the part of the country, we still have violence, and my major point here is that policies, bad policies that are following, that are being adopted in the country to prevent the conflict and also to at least use opportunity to use some of these resources in the country to develop the country is really very difficult. So the country continues to depend on foreign aid and also loan to survive. Why is that? So I just put on something called, if you look at the headlines, I said depiction of free loan aid in South Sudan. So why do I say that? Because since we depend on loans and aid, these aid are being restricted to meet the interest of these people giving these loans. So that means it is conditional. So foreign funds aids to South Sudan to support and elevate the country's development is really conditional and subject to donors' interest. Again, the support of policies that are the core of international neoliberalism package, placing South Sudan into economic and development disadvantage. So if we are not developing on top of all the resources that we have, definitely it is because of conditionality and then the bad policies that has been adopted in the country, limiting actually our development and taking away our resources to benefit people outside the country. Wow. So yeah, how possible is this? How? We talked of conditionality and we talked of bad policy affecting South Sudan. and making it not to develop, and also that the resources in the country are going outside, and people outside are the one benefiting because of the structural adjustment policies. So how possible is that? So a very interesting cartoon here. We have a very good cartoonist. This guy is very brilliant and has a cartoon here that talks about China loans and how it is benefiting South Sudan. So in this cartoon here, we have South Sudan is sitting on oil, and then China is fetching the oil out. At the same time, this oil, China is using it to give loan to South Sudan, and this loan South Sudan will also repay it with interest, and then the cycle continues. That means China's ambitious gamble in South Sudan is really succeeding, and the world power is standing to reap diplomatic and economic benefits. So this is really a very important cartoon, and it justifies the structural adjustment policies that we talked about earlier on, so making South Sudan to be poor again and again. Now we look at the soft power policy that the international community is using to rape away resources from South Sudan, and how they are using the situation to benefit themselves, not to benefit South Sudan now. So when you look at this cartoon, the cartoon is drawn again by this Adija, one of the best cartoonists in South Sudan. He is also interesting. I have to appreciate again and again. So we have the international community using South Sudan as a visibility to raise funds, and most of these funds, they sit in high table, and the peace is still in problem, and South Sudan still remains in chaos. And this also defines that change does not completely come from outside. From outside, we just need a strategy and example to adopt, but the change has to come within, and I think we talked about this earlier on. So current foreign influence and support from aid and loan is affecting economic development of the country, since it is conditional and especially through aid agencies. So they mind their businesses or interest. If you can look here, they are taking selfie and they don't mind about our businesses, and then they impose the soft policies in return for the aid, so the loans that they give to us. And for example, here is that in 2015, IMF advised South Sudan to devalue its currency. So within 6 years, inflation also rate shot up by over 500%. And then the same IMF in 2020 gave 5.2 million US dollars. In 2021, the same IMF also gave 174 million emergency loan to South Sudan, so that the country can stabilize its economy. And IMF just created market for their loan, so they get interest at the last. So some people will say the money is being given to South Sudan, and why don't South Sudan use the money to do other things and so on? Why do they accept this? So what they always do is that they give you a lot of loans, you already owe them, and you're already the economic slave, and when they develop policies to support you, you adapt those policies so that they give you the money. So they first develop a policy, and then they sell the policy to you, and then they accompany that. If this money is around, you can be able to implement this policy. So that is really the the bad impact of these structural policies impacting this country so much, and also other countries across the world. Now we look at the impact of these structural adjustment policies using soft powers to really take resources away from these poor countries, not even poor, rich countries, and that is not benefiting them but benefiting those international countries. So you read this later on the references. I got this quote that says foreign aid is just colonialism in distinguished prolonging conflict in a fragile country. South Sudan is one of the fragile countries, of course. Uh, Biggest donors like the UK, the USAID, France, China, and so on, overly concentrate their foreign aid on their former colonies to perpetuate all the relationship. So they use soft power projections, aid one hand, the other hand to open market for guns, more expensive than the aid. So China plays this in South Sudan a lot. We don't manufacture guns. We don't know where guns are originated. So what they do is they create a situation, give a loan which is very cheap, and then you go and buy gun which is more expensive, and in return you're also charged with the interest, and you keep on using the gun to kill yourself to create more market for their goods, for their aid, and so on. And then giving foreign aid also makes countries dependent instead of independent. Most people in South Sudan, including the government, believe in aid agencies and donations. For now, South Sudan has more aid agencies than business companies. Trust me, you can do more research on this, and that is true. Most of the businesses are run by the foreign nationals, weakening the economy further. And then foreign aid also promotes favoritism. If you have been in South Sudan recently, this causes hatred and violence. Recently, groups of youths in South Sudan expelled their colleagues from other states for taking over jobs in their community. This happened in Eastern Equatoria State. It also happened in Western Equatoria State, and then also in part of Upper Nile, or Great Upper Nile actually, and then some states in the country. So once an NGO employs you, donors set policy that restrict you to organize your community. So employment in aid agencies makes youth forget to support their communities in crisis, hence prolonging violence. And then in future also, these loans that is being given to us, like the developing countries like South Sudan, we will face a lot of difficulties in redeeming their loans, borrowed with the tough conditions. The countries will definitely, specifically South Sudan, will become economic slave to donors, donor countries, or people who give the loan. Definitely, we can say soft power successfully achieved. And there is a question that I raised here to answer this graph that you have seen. And I raised this question, say, why are underdeveloped countries facing challenges to develop? So years over years over years, on top of our resources and on top of everything that we have, we still face challenges, and developing is an issue. So I realized that development is an economic discourse which is being hit harder in underdeveloped countries like South Sudan because of the following. If you look at chart 1 and chart 2, in chart 1, aid and revenue effort. So when countries receive more aid in the form of grants, their domestic revenues decline. Typical example in South Sudan, actually this is a live example. We have too many aids and we have no domestic revenue completely. Our farmers are not producing anything. Our youth vocational training or nothing, nothing is being produced in this country. So you can look at those graphs there and so on. And then when you look at graph 2, chart 2, aid, corruption, and revenue efforts. So we have a lot of aid, and then there's corruption in this aid at the same, and then there's weaker revenue effort. So that means the more corrupt a country, the more its revenue declined when it receives grant aid. We are known to be corrupt. A lot of funds got lost in the country, and all national budgets doesn't go to development. Now, this is really making things very difficult. On top, we also receive aid, and also people receiving aids are taking the advantage that the country is very corrupt, and the aid also keeps on being corrupted and so on. So a lot of aid comes to South Sudan, and if you go to a village where $1 million has been spent to save civilians, you may think that there has been no donation there completely. So yeah, and I gave a recommendation to wrap up here that the provision of grants should be accompanied by government contextualized policies to strengthen domestic institutions. No donor institution should be allowed to dictate the end result of their aid or loan. Aid from loans to grants should be accompanied by strengthening of institutions. So with this, I think you can be able to understand structural adjustment policies and what's happening in South Sudan in relation to these policies. And you can read more. I have references here. The first 4 of the references are books that you have to buy and then read. You can get more of all these highlights that I picked here to demonstrate structural adjustment, how it affects South Sudan. And with this, thank you very much for listening. That marks the end of my case studies.